Okay, we're joined by Will Atkinson here from the University of Bristol to talk about his recent paper on AI and the way it kind of relates to class and business. So thanks a lot for joining us, Will. If you want to find out about more about Will's work, there's a link here to his staff profile. But can we start by you telling us a little bit about the research you've done and what you're up to at the moment?
Sure. Yeah. So most of my research is on social class inequalities, differences in relation to lots of different things, really, people's lifestyles, politics, class at work, and so on. So that's the backbone of what I do. And multi-method researcher, so using qualitative and quantitative methodologies to fit the question at hand, to fit whatever it is that I'm kind of working on. So I have kind of those that skill set to help me with my research interests. But although social class is the kind of core of what I do have broader interests. It tends to the thing with social class as a concept is it tends to enable you to move into other areas. I'm sure people would say the same about whatever their core interests are.
Yep.
But when you study something like social class, you end up moving off into, for example, the relationship with family and gender and so on. So that's been a kind of developing interest, or race, ethnicity, inequalities, discrimination on that front as well. They're kind of looking at the intersections there, or looking at the kind of the power holders at the top, if you like, the kind of top class of society,
Yep.
looking at what's going on amongst them, and seeing the kind of internal struggles amongst the kind of the top class,
Hmm.
what they're up to, and all the rest of it. And that could be, intellectuals, it could be, media figures, politicians, or businesses,
Yep.
the economic elites, which is what I was looking at when I was studying artificial intelligence, which
Yep.
was this kind of paper that we're going to talk about was somewhat serendipitous, to be honest. I was actually looking for data for something else,
Hmm.
for a different project,
Yep.
through the UK data repository. We have a great data bank in the UK that you can kind of look through for survey data to analyze. And I came across this data set, which I kind of looked at and thought, that sounds really, really interesting. And I looked around and found that it hadn't really been used
Okay.
by sociologists in any way. So I thought, yeah, I think I can do something with this. I can certainly think about it sociologically with
Hmm.
the mindset, the kind of approach to sociology that I have. And I have the kind of um, the skill set to be able to do something kind of meaningful with it. So
Yep.
that
Okay. So
was
so yeah,
what I did.
give us a synopsis of the paper. Yeah, what it's about.
Sure. So it's really a case of trying to think sociologically about the rise of artificial intelligence, how to explain it, how to explain how it came about, who has invested in it, who's using it,
Hmm.
and so on. Because as far as I could see, a lot of the research on um, artificial intelligence tended to look at the effects that it has on people's consumption practices, their lifestyles, what they recommended in their social media accounts or what have you, and looking at the kind of biases that get reinforced in that, how people's tastes are kind of solidified by algorithms, or how gender stereotypes or racial stereotypes are reproduced
Yep.
in the kind of image that's produced by AI and so on.
Yeah, and we were looking a lot of that. We were looking at a lot of those aspects throughout the course. Yeah. Yeah.
Fantastic,
Yeah.
yeah. So there's some really great research there,
Yeah.
but there's less on thinking about explaining the origins of artificial intelligence. The kind of exceptions are work done by Marxists, so people who are very much thinking about this in terms of the capitalist class,
Yep.
using artificial intelligence as a new tool for maximizing their kind of profits, the surplus that they can gain from labor, and so on. And that has something to bring to the table.
Yep.
but it suffers the limits of Marxist work generally, which is to end up being a little bit kind of reductive, homogenizing of business interests and so on.
Mm.
These are tendencies that people fall into, so it's a little bit limited. And then you have science and technology studies, which is a huge area of research, which is fascinating, and it's very interested in artificial intelligence
Yep.
and the different actors involved in artificial intelligence. But science and technology studies, and I have colleagues here who specialize in STS and related branches, it does tend to be more interested in description of linkages and connections than explaining, what's going on, using
Yeah.
sociological tools for thinking about causes of how artificial intelligence came about and so on. So
Yep.
that's the kind of backdrop, if you like, to this intervention, thinking about how can we explain the rise of artificial intelligence, and also how can we put that to the test. How can we kind of
Mm.
put our money where our mouth is and use data to actually map out the kind of social structures
Yep.
involved in the origins, the rise of artificial intelligence. So that was the kind of backstory, if you like.
Okay.
That's the kind of main intention of the piece.
Yeah, and you kind of one of the main points is you see businesses kind of positioning and using AI as what you call a conservation strategy. So can you explain that a little bit for us?
Yeah, so the word strategy obviously is quite loaded. There's very specific meaning to this notion of strategy, which relates to the framework, which we might talk about in a little bit. But the basic point is there's lots of different types of strategy that people pursue when they're pursuing their interests. Some of these can be subversive, kind of revolutionary, overhauling how things are done, changing the system, and
Mm.
so on. And this is the way that a lot of people tend to talk about artificial intelligence as being revolutionary, subversive, this brand new thing that's kind of upend the way we do things, upend social relations, and so on. And
Yep.
while obviously there's a sense in which that artificial intelligence has profound impact upon our lives, when you're looking at the kind of explanation for what's going on, how AI has come about, it's actually better to characterize it as a conservation strategy, which is ultimately a kind of strategy for reproducing dominance, reproducing current structures,
Yep.
reproducing current hierarchies, right? So basically, the long story short is it is the powerful, the dominant, who are able to invest and use AI to pursue their interests and reproduce their dominance overall, the
Yep.
kind of reproduction of their power. So it kind of conserves the hierarchy as it is through new means. So that's what we mean by conservation strategy.
Yeah, I think that I really like that, and it's come up a little bit in the course. This kind of idea of the new and its kind of potentials and all this stuff is going to be revolutionized in this kind of positive, efficient way. But like the main, as you're kind of pointing out here, the main players promoting this kind of stuff are essentially like billionaires, business owners, even governments increasingly using this stuff for what look like similar dominance purposes, bureaucratic purposes, dehumanizing purposes. So yeah, I think that really that argument and that kind of conceptual way of positioning that works really well. Yeah, yeah.
Mm.
So, like myself, Will, you're very much influenced by Pierre Bourdieu, and we don't really talk. We're not really kind of talking about these kind of theories too much in this course specifically. But can you maybe just give a kind of brief synopsis about why the sociology of Bourdieu is useful for this kind of field relational analysis?
Yeah, so it's a good contrast with Marxism, which I just mentioned
Yep.
as being, a little bit reductive and homogenizing and so on. The real insight of Bourdieu's sociology is to always think relationally or spatially, to always kind of explode out what we might think of as a group or a category into a kind of universe of internal difference and opposition and struggle, right? So we think about the ruling class or the dominant class, the elite, and so on. But actually, this is, a very kind of internally fractured, internally opposed, internally struggling,
Mm.
kind of group of agents or actors. And Bourdieu kind of has this insight for lots of different categories, groups that we think of in relation to class, in relation to artists or what have you, but also in relation to business.
Mm.
So, people would think of the capitalist class or capitalists as a whole, um, from a Marxist point of view, as being kind of like, the entity that we're interested in. But Bourdieu is interested in looking within that, and this notion of field is all about looking for the fault lines, the points of opposition and dominance within this kind of category or group that others would just kind of take as a homogenous thing.
Yep.
So that's what we're doing here. We're kind of using this notion of field to look at businesses, to think of them as a kind of a field of businesses who are kind of locked in competition and struggle and so on. And this is the kind of real engine for people's strategies for subversion or conservation. They're ultimately kind of pursuing dominance or position within this field. Obviously, Bourdieu uses the term capital to get at what it is that people are chasing within a field. There's different forms of capital, different forms of resource, or different forms of authority and power that people are kind of striving for. And some people have more, some people have less, or they have different types of capital, different types of authority and esteem within the field. And this gives us a sense of structure of, not only kind of high and low within the field, the dominant and the dominated, but also, which kind of types of capital people have more of.
Yep.
So in relation to businesses, we're thinking about, the kind of dominant businesses, the kind of large, FTSE in the UK context, businesses and so on, versus the kind of small players, the kind of small enterprises, and so on, but also different kind of sectors or different what we think of as subfields of
Yep.
the business field. They sit in opposition to one another as well. So we have this kind of framework for thinking about differences, oppositions, which frame people's sort of sense of their place, sense of what's possible within the field, sense of what's a kind of good thing to do, a strategy
Mm-hmm.
suit of the kind of resources and esteem that you get from being a part of this field. It kind of gives us that alternative to Marxism, as well as giving us a mode of explaining what's going on, which is what's missing from a
Yeah.
lot of science and technology studies.
Okay, great. Yeah, that's really good. And before we move on to the data itself, can you just tell us a little bit? You mentioned already you kind of come across this by accident, but can you mention a little bit about the method for the analysis in this paper?
Sure. So the method of analysis is a particular technique which is very closely associated with Bourdieu and this notion of field, of mapping out the oppositions and structures of a field. So this technique is called multiple correspondence analysis, and obviously not going to go into the technicalities of it, but what it does is, if you have like a few variables, set of variables, categorical variables, right? So, whether it's whatever it might be measuring, you have kind of discrete categories that are making up that variable rather than being a continuous variable. And what multiple correspondence analysis does is it looks for patterns of association or opposition between those categories of all the different variables that you put into the model. So it looks, is category A in one variable associated with category B in another model,
Yep.
or the people who answer yes to that question answer yes to that question, or no to that question, that other question, and so on. And it kind of translates those associations into a spatial representation. It gives you a map of distances and directions between the different categories of the variables, so you can get a sense of what are the kind of main points of difference
Yep.
within this set of data.
And so you end up with this kind of field maps like this that we'll come to back to in a second. Yeah.
That's right. Yeah.
Great. Okay. Rightio. So let's spend the last kind of part of the talk you just kind of describing and giving us some analysis from the data here. So this is the title. The title of this is the structure of the British economic field. So what do we have in the data here?
Yeah. So basically, the survey data had loads of really interesting variables on people's intentions or business intentions to use AI, different types of AI. As you can see, there's a few different types covered by the survey, kind of robotics and hardware, right up to the kind of machine learning, language processing, the large language models that seem to be much more prominent nowadays.
Yep.
The data is actually from 2021, so it's a little bit kind of just predates the latest boom
Yep.
in AI technology, which came with the kind of real development of large language models and the application to big data. So it's a really interesting kind of time point.
Mm-hmm.
It's like just before, so it's almost like kind of predicting a little bit what came after, even though we don't really want to get into the business of prediction in social science too much. But yeah, so basically this table just kind of gives a breakdown of what businesses are doing, whether they have plans or not. You can see most businesses at this time weren't planning to use artificial intelligence. Some were starting to think about it or kind of playing around with it. But there was also a proportion that had been using it for a little bit.
Yeah. And we have a similar thing here, thinking about the costs, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So you get this kind of stratification in how much businesses are investing in aspects of AI, whether it's the technology or the labor involved in producing artificial intelligence technology. So again, there's a stratification. Many are spending, only a little bit, small overall amount of money per year and so on, whereas you do have some who are spending millions.
Yeah. Do you know what kind of businesses were spending the millions?
So this is kind of like the main bulk of the analysis, which shows that obviously it's the larger companies that that have the capacity to be able to invest so much money. But also certain types of businesses tend to do it more than others, right? So the kind of ICT companies, but also certain manufacturing companies are the ones that are spending the really huge amounts here.
Yeah, and as we've come to see in the last 5 years since the kind of the creation of the AI bubble, scale is really important, and all this kind of stuff is really ramped up for sure. Yeah, and so here you have a similar table here about the kind of anticipated possible increases or decreases in rates of spending on this kind of stuff. Yeah. So
this is really interesting for getting an insight into what people are thinking about in the future, because part of the interest with Bourdieu and the Bourdieu framework is thinking about kind of people's sense of the field, of what's kind of going on, how things are changing, and what they might have to do or might be able to do in the future. And you don't often get a lot of really good data on that. But certainly with this data set, there are these kind of variables that allow you just to kind of get that insight into their feel for the game. Right. That kind of sense of what they're going to have to do in the coming years.
Yeah, that's right. And here, what have we got in this table here?
Right. So these figures relate to that map that you showed a moment ago, the kind of results of the multiple correspondence analysis. What this is showing us is how much variance in the overall data or inertia in the data is explained by the different axes of opposition within the model. Okay. Now, normally with a map, a multiple correspondence analysis map, you're going to be wanting to have enough axes to explain about 80% of the inertia, or modified inertia as it's called here, for specific reasons. In this case, the first axis of difference in the model, the first dimension, is very powerful. It's a very powerful axis. But the second dimension, which it's much less powerful, let's put it that way, it only accounts for quite a small portion of the modified inertia, but it's sociologically meaningful. And this is another kind of criterion that we use for thinking about which axes should we actually bother interpreting in a model. Not only how much inertia, how much variance it accounts for, but is it sociologically meaningful and interesting? And in this case, although we can absolutely say the first axis is the major one, this second axis does give us an insight into something interesting.
Okay, can you just briefly explain what inertia is there when you're talking about that? What's inertia mean?
Yeah, it just means variance, right? The kind of overall variance in what goes with what's associated with what's opposed to what, and so on. That those associations,
Yep.
the likelihoods of people responding yes to one question and yes to another, or no, or whatever
Yep.
category it may be, you can kind of put that in numerical terms in terms of variance, and then you can look at the proportion of variance that's explained by different principles of association.
Yep. Okay, and we're getting towards the end here, so can you tell us what the field map kind of tells us here?
Yeah, absolutely. So the two axes here, the first axis is the vertical axis, separating out the top and the bottom there of the figure. And basically, this is an axis, this powerful axis is one of dominance. The dominant large firms, are at the top, and those that are smaller with a much smaller turnover, annual turnover, and so on, are at the bottom. But what's also interesting is there is some relationship with sector. So we do see a kind of opposition between, kind of more toward the top of the space. We have the kind of finance
Yep.
sector located, predominantly or disproportionately in London. And then we have at the bottom of the space the kind of firms that are located in the kind of arts sector or the education sector, health sector, and so on. So they tend to be the kind of lower revenue, smaller, dominated firms within the space as a whole. So we do. This is the primary point of difference in the space, but we do have this interesting secondary opposition, this horizontal opposition, which is mainly about an opposition of manufacturing on the one hand, the kind of old industries, if you like,
Yep.
and kind of newer industries. On the one hand, finance toward the top of the space, and at the bottom, kind of arts, leisure, education, health, and so on. So it's kind of like a triangular model. It looks like a triangular model here, but if you kind of look at the patterning of individual firms within the space, which you can do, you can kind of look at where all the individuals
Yep.
Are situated. Then you see that manufacturing kind of isn't all concentrated in that one point. It ranges right from the top to the bottom of the space along this premier axis. So you have a kind of very internally very differentiated sector with manufacturing.
Okay.
Some very huge, large firms, but also lots of small firms. Whereas with education and so on, tend to be small as a whole, whereas finance tend to be high revenue.
Yep.
So
Yep.
that's a kind of basic breakdown of the space.
Yeah, and we kind of have the kind of the broader AI adoption kind of summed up in this table here. Yeah, yeah, and the sector.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, this is like a kind of summary scale of
Yeah.
AI adoption. The higher you are on the scale, the more likely it is that you are or will be investing in artificial intelligence technology. And you can see the stratification by revenue that goes across sectors,
Yeah.
but also there's differences between sectors in rates of investment.
Yeah, great. Okay, so we're getting towards the end here. So I'll just put this up just so students can read this. You kind of again outlining the AI thing as a conserving force here in terms of, I suppose, conserving the power structures and class structures of society broadly. Can you maybe give us some kind of where do you think this is going in the future, like, and maybe even a kind of synopsis of where it's gone since this research was done?
Yeah, so it's a tricky one, right? Because there are with artificial intelligence particularly, there are so many different predictions and interpretations of what they think is going to happen. And I since I did the research, I would say that obviously I kind of did it a couple of years ago. The data was from just before the kind of latest boom, and the conversation has only got much more intense around artificial intelligence and its likely impact on everything that we do. And the doomsayers and the techno optimists are, they're kind of polarizing the debate. The kind of scenarios that we are given are very extreme. And there's a lot of sociological work from some of my colleagues here who are kind of interested in the production of these discourses and kind of the effects that they have on people's views about artificial intelligence and so on. The short answer is I don't know. I don't know where it's going to go. Um, I'm keenly watching, and very curious, and it's incumbent upon us as sociologists to keep a track and to research what comes about.
Hmm.
I do think that there will be profound changes in employment, um, and that's probably the kind of main place I see some of the really kind of transformative effects. Um, and again, it will be a case of not only tracking those effects, but tracking, the interests lying behind
Hmm.
the causes of those.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
kind of the whole point of the paper is to really make sure that we're not just getting swamped by looking at the effects as they are devastating and so on, and kind of we have to document how they are impacting people's experiences, their work, their leisure, and all the rest of it. But let's just make sure that we're also looking at what's going on behind this, at who's instrumented this, and why.
Yeah.
What purposes? What did they want out of it?
Yeah.
Uh,
That's great. I think, yeah, very key sociological questions. Yeah. Yeah.
mm.
Yeah. Excellent. Well, that's a great way to finish. I'll stop us there. Thanks so much for your time.
Okay, no problem. Thank you.